Hey, what's going on, everybody? It's the CD guy, Johnny Z here. Thank you so much for tuning back into the channel, and today I'm going to be counting down my top 20 favorite death metal bands of all time, and that's an important word right there, favorite. So, of course, there's a lot of great death metal acts out there, but for me, I just whittled it down to my 20 personal favorites. So everyone's list is going to be different here. Lots of bands that unfortunately I could not fit on this list, but let's get started here. My 20 personal favorite. Kicking off the list here, let's go with Napalm Death at number 20. I always loved the range the band showed in their early stuff, as they were one of the first to incorporate, crust punk with the death metal sound, something that was pretty unique at the time of their debut album, which is probably my favorite record of theirs as well. I think groundbreaking for its elements of heavy metal mixed with punk rock, which defined both sides of the record respectively. And also, fun fact, that album is responsible for the shortest song of all time, which appears on that record, which is pretty cool. But just in general, Napalm Death, I think, are a great band, and, like I said before, one of the first to incorporate that kind of crust sound with the death metal. So when it comes down to it, very influential, I think, and super important as well. Number 19, I'm going to go with Vader. Formed in 1983, the band initially started out as more of a traditional heavy metal act before experimenting with thrash and speed metal, before finding their sound with death metal and releasing their debut album 10 years after their formation. And since their debut album, they've been, in my opinion, one of the most consistent bands in death metal. So they've endured a whole bunch of lineup changes over their 11 studio releases since their debut, but in my opinion, very consistent, and I don't think they have a bad album out there. So with that in mind, had to make it on my list here. Coming in at number 19, I'm going to go with Vader. Number 18, I'm going to go with Behemoth. Super important for their role in the formation of the extreme metal underground. Behemoth are a band that really never liked to be labeled, but I've no doubt done a fantastic job of combining elements of thrash and black metal with their black and death metal style. And although some people might consider them to be a bit, what's the word? I guess overrated. Albums, in my opinion, like Demigod, The Apostasy, and Evangelion have definitely earned them a spot here on this list for sure. As far as I'm concerned, I think they're a great band. I enjoy the most recent record as well. So for me personally, I don't find them to be overrated at all. As a matter of fact, I think they're an appropriately rated band, and wanted to put them here on this list. Coming in at number 18, gonna go with Behemoth. One of the best live bands on this list, my number 17, technical death metal legends Nile. I think absolutely deserve a spot in the top 20. And just like I was talking about with Vader earlier, I think they're another very consistent band, right? In my opinion, they never made a bad record, and I think most would consider a lot of their post-Annihilation of the Wicked material to be a bit of a decline in quality. But for me personally, I enjoy everything they've done, and I think that they're an act that know their sound, know their style, and have incredible songwriting and musicianship. Number 16, Gorguts are one of the most technical bands out there, and to be honest, I didn't love them at first, but I think they're a band that have grown on me a ton over time, and Gorguts are super eccentric in their sound and their experimentation, so a first impression of them can be pretty jarring, right, for the first time you ever hear them. But I think a great example of this is on the Obscura record. Everyone beamed about this album, so when I gave it a listen, it took me a few listens to really, before it really clicked and before I really started to enjoy it. So I think definitely a band that upon a first impression, like I said, I use the word jarring. I think that's very fair, but I've grown to appreciate how different they are more and more over time. So in the end, I find them to be really enjoyable and eccentric. So with that in mind, they're my number 16 here on the list. People are going to hate this next pick here because a lot of the extreme metal community are not fans of this band, but for me personally, I think they're great and very underrated. So with that in mind, coming in at number 15 here, I'm going to go with Macabre. Some find them to be far too gimmicky, but I think that's part of what makes them unique, drawing inspiration from true crime on classics like the Sinister Slaughter and Murder Metal album. They're definitely not the most proficient or technically sound band on this list, but I think they make up for it in spades with their originality and their uniqueness as well. So for me personally, they're a band that, I love how different they are, and so for that reason, I wanted to include them here on this list. Not to mention the fact that Dennis DeMenace is one of the most underrated extreme metal drummers of all time, which can't hurt. So with that in mind, my number 15 here on the list, I have to go with Macabre, even though I know some people are going to disagree with this. For me, I think they're very underrated and very unique as well, so that's definitely something that caught my ear when I first listened to them. Rest in peace, Trevor Sternad. Coming in at number 14 on the list, I'm going to go with the Black Dahlia Murder. Such a fun band to listen to. Trevor Sternad was an amazing frontman for the group with a very unique and distinct, recognizable voice, prior to his passing, of course, which is very unfortunate. They were influenced a lot by the band Carcass, who I'll get to in a little bit on this list, but they were a force in the world of melodic death metal, and of course now it's never going to be the same after Trevor's passing, but I am glad that they're going to continue on moving forward. I think that's a good thing, but, when it comes down to the golden years of the band, it was definitely during the lifetime of Trevor Sternad, an amazing frontman, again, and did a lot of great work with the band in the 21st century. One of my all-time favorite metal frontmen of 2000 through 2009, the early 2000s. There, I think they did some fantastic work, and Trevor, just the absolute lifeblood of that band during his lifetime, and somebody who was very, very unique and belted out some great vocals, but was also a really fun frontman to watch. So, it's never going to be the same again with the Black Dahlia murder, but like I said, I am glad that they're going to be continuing on. Major players in the Gothenburg melodic death metal scene, my number 13 on the list here at the gates are definitely one of those influential Swedish metal acts of all time for sure, securing them a spot here close to the top 10. I think 1995 Slaughter of the Soul is one of my personal favorite death metal albums in all of the Swedish death metal scene, and, they've since done some really solid work since their reunion in 2011, so with that in mind, again, like I said, I wanted to put them close to the top 10 here, so coming in at number 13, let's go with At the Gates. For my number 12, I'm going to go with Cancer, a great blend of thrash and death metal. Cancer have only made 6 studio albums throughout their career, including Death Shall Rise, which would definitely be in my top 10 favorite death metal albums list, which is a video for another day, especially if you guys enjoy this one, but James Murphy's playing on that record is just unreal, and, I really do enjoy his tenure in the band, and he otherwise did some great work with some other fantastic groups, such as Death, Obituary, Testament, and Disincarnate. Number 11, let's go with Cattle Decapitation, the band who currently hold the title of my personal favorite death metal album of 2023 thus far, with Terracite. They've released 8 studio albums since 2002. I think one of the most interesting things about this band is, how their sound has evolved over the years, right? Their production quality as well. They sounded not so great from a production standpoint on their first few records, but, really increased their production and sound from Monolith moving forward. So, in my opinion, they're one of the best death metal, or you want to call them death grind acts of the 21st century. So with that in mind, coming in at number 11 here, I'm going to go with Cattle Decapitation. We move on now into the top 10. Coming in at number 10, I'm going to go with Entombed. Early pioneers of the Scandinavian death metal scene, Entombed would eventually settle on a more death and roll type sound by the 90s, right? I love their, sound and guitar tone, which can best be described as a buzzsaw-like sound, and one of the factors that separated Scandinavian death metal from its US counterparts, and the death and roll aspect of their sound has allowed them to show a bit more range over the years in their career as well. First in garage rock and a bit of groove to their sound in addition to that, so I find that to be really interesting. I think they're a great band and definitely belong in the top 10, so getting us started here in the top 10, coming at number 10 here, let's go with Entombed. Number 9, Bolt Thrower. My introduction to Bolt Thrower was through the Those Once Loyal record, and I was absolutely hooked by the the melodic riffs and the killer solos on top of the vicious growled vocals by Carl Willits, and that would end up being their last full-length studio album, right? But I think the rest of their catalog is extremely strong as well. Outside of Death and Cannibal Corpse, which are, two very strong bands when you're first starting to get into death metal and get a feel for it, they were one of the first death metal acts that I ever got into a while back when I was first getting into the genre. So with that in mind, I definitely am a little bit partial to Bolt Thrower, but I think their music definitely does speak for itself. So with that in mind, my number 9 on the list, I gotta go with Bolt Thrower. Influenced by acts like Death, Macabre, King Diamond, and Slayer, as well as many more, my number 8 on the list here, Carcass, are definite pioneers of the melodic death metal scene, and in their early years, there really wasn't anybody quite like them, right? Nobody really had that kind of a sound, so it's a bit jarring at first for a lot of people, and that's why they referred to it as a number of different styles, including splatter death metal and hard gore, so they really did find their footing by the mid-90s with the release of Heartwork in 1993, one of the greatest and most important melodic death metal albums of all time. Next at number 7, we have Immolation, a leading force in the New York death metal scene. Immolation were a band that first caught my ear, heard of their great dueling guitar sound and killer riffage, and, overall, their sound is pretty complex and unique in the sense that the drum parts were often written to follow the guitar riffs, which is sonically uncommon in most death metal bands, so I definitely find that to be very interesting, and it's a big reason as to why they're in my top 10. Coming in at number 7 here, let's go with New York death metal legends, Immolation. Speaking of great acts from that New York death metal scene, coming in at number 6 here, I'm going to go with Suffocation, who I think definitely belong in my top 10 just for their sheer influence and longevity alone. Looking at their catalog, there isn't a single stinker in the bunch as far as I'm concerned, and I enjoy everything they've ever done. I'd have to rank them just a little bit higher than their New York counterparts in Immolation at number 7, so with that in mind, coming in at number 6 here, let's go with Suffocation, another great band from that New York death metal scene. Breaking into the top 5 here with my number 5, I'm going to go with Dismember, a band that are now considered to be members of the Swedish death metal Big Four. They're pioneers for sure and helped to put Swedish death metal on the map with their nearly perfect debut record, Like an Ever-Flowing Stream, which I'll go out on a limb here on record and say that without that album, the Swedish death metal scene would look very different now looking back on it. So with that in mind, they're an extremely important band to that entire scene and highly influential as well, and a massive part of putting Swedish death metal on the map, like I had said. So with that in mind, they're my number 5 here on the list. Have to go with Dismember, getting us started in the top 5. Illid Divinum Insanus not included. My number 4 here on the list, Morbid Angel, have been one of the most impeccable death metal acts since their beginnings in 1983 as part of the Florida death metal scene. And of course, Altars of Madness are an absolute classic, and it's for good reason, right? But I also love the complexity of the band's sound. I really dig the drumming style of Pete Sandoval, who is definitely one of those proficient drummers in all of death metal. So I think they're a fantastic band, and of course their best known album is Altars of Madness, but they've done some fantastic work outside of that. And like I said before, pretty impeccable outside of that one stinker of a record, which I've talked about at length, one of my most hated albums of all time. But when it comes down to it, Morbid Angel have done some incredible work that definitely secure them a spot here in the top 5. Top 3 now. For my number 3, let's go with Obituary, a band who have been around since the beginnings of death metal, formed in 1984. The band experimented with a number of different names before settling on Obituary in 1988, and they have not looked back since, right? I think John Tardy is still an amazing vocalist for the band, belting it out on their most recent album, The Dying of Everything. Fantastic record released earlier this year that I would consider to be another one of my favorites from 2023 thus far when it comes to great death metal releases. So with that in mind, my number 3 here on the list, have to go with Obituary. Number 2, let's go with Cannibal Corpse. I'm very excited personally for the new album coming out this September, so stay tuned to the channel because I will be reviewing it the day that it drops, so turn on notifications now so you don't miss it, I guess. But whether you like the Corpse Grinder Fisher era of the band or the Chris Barnes era better, it's all essential death metal in my opinion. And I've heard some people compare Cannibal Corpse to the Iron Maiden of death metal, and compare Death to the Black Sabbath of death metal, and I think that's pretty spot on. I think they're one of the greatest and most important metal bands of all time, regardless of the era or who was fronting the group. So with that in mind, of course, they had to be close to the number 1 spot here on this list. Maybe a bit predictable, but they're a great band, and they deserve it. So coming in at number 2 here, we have the fantastic Cannibal Corpse. And number 1, well, I referenced them, so I'm sure you guys saw this coming. I have to go with Death. There's a good chance that death metal, as we know and love it today, would be a very different scene without Death. I find that a lot of new and up-and-coming death metal bands struggle with originality these days because everybody draws influence from Death, and why not, right? They're a great band to be influenced by, but I think everyone tries to be Chuck Schuldiner these days, when reality is there was only one Chuck Schuldiner, right? And his musical prowess and vision for the band really did expand throughout their catalog as they became more technical and melodic as their discography went on. I think Symbolic probably their best record, but they're a band that never made a bad album either. Chuck Schuldiner was, an absolute visionary for the group, had a great voice as well, and of course there'd be a lot of lineup changes over the years, and Chuck Schuldiner was the one constant throughout, an incredible musician in my opinion, the lifeblood of this band, and when he passed away, it was a massive blow to death metal, and there really never will be another band quite like Death, and never be another mind for death metal like Chuck Schuldiner. So when I said before that a lot of bands are drawing influence from Chuck, and everyone's trying to be Chuck Schuldiner these days, there's just only one, and when it comes down to it, that's what made Death so special. So with that in mind, my number 1 here on the list, have to go with Death. Maybe a predictable choice, but for me personally, there were none better. So that wraps up this list, counting down my top 20 favorite death metal bands of all time. Of course, there's a lot of great bands out there, but these are just my top 20 favorite, which should be visible right over here. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel down below, turn on the bell for notifications so you never miss a new upload, and let me know down in the comment section below what are some of your favorite death metal acts of all time. I want to hear from you, so please let me know all that good stuff down in the comments. And until next time, it's the CD guy, Johnny Z, signing off. Take care, everybody.